This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, ahead of an open discussion at the University of Cyprus next week, we examine imperialism and regional struggles in Palestine, Syria and Lebanon, and discuss how Cyprus is dealing with them.
Tying its economic fortunes to basically the Israeli or Western war machine. And obviously this is something that will not benefit most people, leaving the moral implications aside. It's something that, that will be accompanied by the usual corruption and kickbacks.
And we hear about new tools to deal with the trafficking of cultural artifacts.
There will be various tools that are being developed for the protection of cultural heritage and tackling illicit trafficking of cultural goods.
On Wednesday next week, there's an open discussion taking place at the University of Cyprus. One of the speakers is my guest on this week's programme. He's going to discuss Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, imperialism and regional struggles. Well, if you're a regular listener, you'll know that we've been covering those items, well, certainly for the last year or more. Welcome to Leandros Fischer. Leandros, what are you actually going to be initially saying on Wednesday at that discussion?
I'm going to be talking about two things that are usually seen by many people as being completely separate and unrelated to each other. And those two things are, on the one hand, the geopolitics of the region, as we have seen in the last 1.5 years of genocide in the Gaza Strip, but also in other areas, for example, the war waged by Israel against Lebanon, and also the recent overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, and the various geopolitical variables involved. And the other thing is the question of regional struggles, movements, social movements, even revolutions that have been taking place in the region, not successfully, unfortunately, since around 2011. So I'm going to talk about how actually we should think of those two things not as separate, but actually as, quite entangled with each other in many, many ways. If this sounds vague, I also think that it also relates to the way that those events are being perceived in Cyprus by many people on all sides of the political spectrum. So there is, on the one hand, a tendency to reduce everything that's happening in the region to great power, big power politics. And at the end of the day, the question arises, the usual question emerges: how does this benefit us?
That's the bottom line, is it not, Leandros? Because am I being terribly simplistic if I say that we need to go back, don't we, in time to the original colonialism in the Middle East and the areas that you've been talking about, the carving up of land and distributing it to suit us? And us, I mean the West. But we also have to look at the tribal and religious differences that already exist in the region, do we not?
Yeah, I mean, you're opening a can of worms.
I'm afraid I do that quite often because it seems to me that the whole Middle East and regional question is a can of worms and nobody seems to know how to deal with it.
Well, I think a big problem in thinking about the Middle East, especially in Cyprus, is to kind of think of Cyprus as being outside of the Middle East and not really being entangled with it and being some kind of an organic part of the West, which it is at some parts, but not entirely. And I think the other problem, which you see especially you see in Western discourse, but you see that especially accentuated in Greek Cypriot discourse, is this over-accentuating of those differences that you've mentioned. The differences as regards to culture, religion, language, of course, are manifold, as they are everywhere. But those differences, they are not of determining significance about what's going on in the region. They are economic interests, class interests, and geopolitical interests that are actually the shaping forces behind many of the conflicts that we see today. And when I say that the question that inevitably arises in Cyprus is, how does this benefit us? I don't necessarily mean the West, I mean Cyprus. To give you just an example, the majority of political forces, maybe 95% of those, support the extraction of hydrocarbons in the sea basin between Cyprus, Lebanon, and Palestine. And this is something that can only be done by collaborating with a genocidal state, which is the state of Israel. And it's not only aiding and abetting genocide, but it's also ecocide. Now, the reasoning behind supporting this, even by people who are very, very extremely critical of what Israel has been doing in Gaza and elsewhere, is that, you know, this will bring prosperity, and this will create a kind of a catalyst for solving the Cyprus problem. And you see that at this point, there is a certain parochialism that runs through the entire discourse in Cyprus regarding the Middle East. So one of the things that I'll be trying to do in the coming talk is actually to show how, you know, the fate of all those things, of the environment, of peace, and of social justice and economic justice in the entire region is actually quite entangled. And we cannot actually think of Cyprus as this separate box, which, you know, belongs to the West, but has randomly been located in the Middle East.
We don't tend, I think, to join up the dots, do we, in Cyprus? We think, as you said, that we are an island, and therefore it's entirely up to us who we go along with. We were with Russia for years, now we're suddenly kowtowing to the West. But I've always found it very odd that our relationship with Israel is what it is, because we are ourselves partially occupied, and we don't seem to have any problem getting into bed with somebody else who is occupying another country.
Well, yes, I mean, you're pointing to the question of analogies, which I personally reject. I don't think that we should support Palestinians in their struggle for self-determination due to this somehow being related to our history, to begin with, quite abstractly speaking. Second of all, I think there is the analogy between both questions is a bit problematic, because we do have two conflicts that have emerged from the same historical event, which is the breakup of the Ottoman Empire some 150 years ago. On the other hand, what we do have in Palestine is a settler colonial conflict, which involves a group of people coming from elsewhere, from the West, aiming to settle in a foreign land and create a state, excluding the indigenous population.
Isn't that almost what's happening in the north of Cyprus, with all the settlers from Turkey?
Well, I would disagree with that, because what you have in Cyprus is something that resembles more what has been going on in the Balkans, in Bosnia. There are, of course, aspects that each side can claim to be identical with the fate of the Palestinians. On the one hand, we did have ethnic cleansing of Greek Cypriots from the north in 1974. But if we are very honest with each other, it was actually the Turkish Cypriots in the 1960s had the fate of being faced by checkpoints and roadblocks and having their access to water and electricity being cut off by the government. So we can play this game endlessly and try to find this or that analogy. My point here is that we should not actually be concerned about what's happening close to us because it's somehow, I don't believe the argument that says that the Republic of Cyprus is acting against its own interests by siding with Israel. On the contrary, it's siding with its own material interests, which at the end of the day are also class interests, which at the end of the day are the interests of, the known complex of developers and law firms and construction companies that have been the main force in the last 15 years in squeezing down real wages for ordinary people, in driving rents up high, by destroying green spaces and public spaces and making Cyprus much more unaffordable for everyday people. So in a way, you can see here a bit what the connection is that I'm trying to make, is that we have to actually liberate ourselves from this thinking, which I would call, not just me, but in the social sciences, we call this methodological nationalism, which is about thinking about social processes as happening in contained, isolated national boxes. And to give you another example, we have, for many years now, the mainstream media in the Republic of Cyprus have been demonizing migrants and basically presenting people from Syria or from Africa as threats. But actually, if you go down to the base of society, you will see actually that there are decades and decades of historical interactions, social interactions taking place between ordinary Cypriots or ordinary Syrians or Egyptians or even Africans. So it's about actually going beyond the standard discourse on these issues that concerns me the most in the coming talk.
Would you say that the whole way our governments have been acting in the last, decade or so has exacerbated that view of migrants? And again, I come back to the fact that if we go back to 1974, how many Cypriots migrated abroad and made their lives there and were welcomed?
Yeah, there is no rule stating that people who suffered one injustice are immune from perpetuating that injustice themselves.
Oh, well, we're seeing that very clearly, aren't we, in the Middle East at the moment?
Yeah, of course. But if we actually look at closer examples, we don't only see that with the Cypriots who have been victims of colonialism. We also see that with the Irish. There is also anti-migrant sentiment in Ireland. We see that with Greeks being discriminated as guest workers in Germany. The list goes on and on and on. But I do think that the demonization of migrants, again, this is another question where you have this contrast between, this very Cyprus-centric view and a kind of a more global perspective. The demonization of migrants is not some kind of Cypriot peculiarity. It's not because the Cypriots are horkadi, as some people would like to state. And if we followed every iota of the EU rules, everything would be great, and we would have this, little Sweden here, which is very tolerant and whatever, even though Sweden isn't tolerant. It is a global process. We have a global process where, in the midst of an ongoing economic crisis, which has been going on for the past 17 years, there is a certain renationalization of policies, as we can see with, the election of people like Trump and his allies everywhere in key countries of the West.
I was going to come and ask you about what effect you think Trump's latest interventions in our area are likely to have. Last I heard, certainly the King of Jordan was saying a red line, we are not taking all these people, you can't push them out of Gaza. What do you think is going to happen there?
I think it's something quite alarming, but I also I would urge you to actually see that what Trump has been saying about Gaza now has been floated about a year ago by the Biden administration. And this is another thing that, if we're going to connect the dots here, brings me to the subject of migration. There isn't such a contradiction between somebody like Biden on the one hand and somebody like Trump, or somebody like, Emmanuel Macron in France and Marine Le Pen. It's not in the sense that, they are equally bad or, there's no difference between their policies, but the policies of the former pave the way and legitimize the policies of the later. And to come back to the question of migration in Cyprus, there is a certain misconception, which again I would call methodologically nationalist, which kind of sees this demonization of migrants as being a kind of a Cypriot quirk, and the fact that Cypriots are allegedly not enlightened enough. The reality is that the prime driver behind those policies is the European Union itself. Last May, if you recall, we had a deal that was signed between the European Union and Lebanon at the behest of Cyprus, which basically turns Lebanon into a kind of, a prison guard for people wanting to reach the European Union via Cyprus in exchange for economic aid. And this is actually based on the original deal that the EU signed with Turkey in 2016, which has the same principle. You see, there is a tendency to externalize bordering practices. Case in point, the UK with the Rwandan scheme of paying African countries money to accept people who are not from there, but which, countries like the UK wants to deport. And that in turn is based, actually, the original inventors of this policy have been the Australians in the early 2000s with their idea of putting asylum seekers in underdeveloped small Pacific island nations in exchange for money. Anyway, I'm closing this parenthesis to kind of show how all these things, Israel's genocide against Gaza, migration, the demonization in Cyprus, they're all aspects that are related to each other. And the fact that migrants are demonized is not because people have this innate fear of the other and, we should just give them books to read and have them take awareness classes and, racism will disappear. There are also concrete material interests behind the demonization of migrants. If you actually look who owns most of the mainstream media in Cyprus and who dominates the public broadcasters, it's all people from political forces which have been overwhelmingly applying policies in favor of big capital, in favor of developers, in favor of all those things that are making life for ordinary Cypriots much more difficult materially.
Okay, we have to start wrapping this up, Leandro. Sorry about that. But just finally, I want to ask you, there seems to be no end to the military-industrial complex. I mean, we even talked, or the president did recently, about opening up defence companies here in Cyprus. This is where the money's to be made, and without keeping those going, would we actually have even a remote chance of maybe stopping the migration because people wouldn't leave their homes if they weren't being attacked all the time? And I'm talking now about even sub-Saharan Africa. There's loads of places that this applies.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is a contradiction there, obviously, but capital thinks in very short-term terms. What you do have here is something similar when they implemented the Golden Passport scheme, a policy that was morally
questionable,
a bit shady. Was justified with a sort of a trickling down effect, and it will bring prosperity to people, and it will help us get through the economic crisis. Now you have the same thing, but on a much more shadier and much more morally questionable basis, which is about turning Cyprus into this basically an extension of the Israeli high-tech / security sector, of which it actually already is for the past 10 years, and tying its economic fortunes to, basically the Israeli or Western war machine. And obviously this is something that will not benefit most people, leaving the moral implications aside. It's something that, that will be accompanied by the usual corruption and kickbacks. And it's something that I believe we must thoroughly oppose and not be misguided by this standard argument that this is somehow equals prosperity, equals peace, which is the same morally flawed argument that has been used for the past 20 years in regards to hydrocarbons.
Well, and it also means, of course, that the prosperity, if and when it does come, is for a very small section of society, isn't it? We're going to have to wrap it up there. I'm sorry, Leandros, but I'm sure that it will be a fascinating discussion. Wednesday, February the 5th, starting at 7 p.m. at the University of Cyprus. And we've been talking to Leandros Fisher, who is one of the speakers, along with Irish MP Richard Boyd Barrett. Leandros, many thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
We're going to talk now about archaeology. Marios Tsouvaras is the research coordinator of the Eratosthenes Centre of Excellence, and they have an event coming up that's all part of a Horizon Europe project called Enigma. And it sounds fascinating. Marios, many thanks for joining me. First, maybe tell us a little bit about this Enigma project and the involvement of your Centre of Excellence.
Thanks for the invitation, Rosie. Enigma project is a Horizon Europe project, as you said. It's funded by the European Union. It has to do with endorsing, safeguarding, protection, and provenance management of cultural heritage. It's a 3-year project. It started January of 2023 and it's finishing at the end of the current year. There are 12 partners from 7 different countries. Eratosthenes Center of Excellence is one of the Cypriot entities participating in the project. Eratosthenes Center of Excellence, it's a research institute focused on Earth observation and geoinformatics, with a focus in the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East and North Africa region. I'm head of research at the center. One of the clusters dealing with the cultural heritage is greatly involved in this project, with me as the principal investigator. The specific cluster consists of 11 researchers from 7 different countries. So it's a multicultural, let's say, group working on various topics on areas of cultural heritage and archaeological, let's say, research interest. Now going to the project, we are organizing an event, like you said, next Wednesday. It's going to be held at the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus. It's a hybrid event. It's going to be from 9 to 12. It's co-organized by Eratosthenis Center of Excellence, the Association of Cypriot Archaeologists, the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus, and the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute. And we will be glad to have with us the Cyprus Police, the Department of Antiquities, and the ICOMOS. During this event, we'll present the overall, let's say, Enigma project. It's called Enigma in a nutshell. That's how it's placed in the agenda. The Enigma tool architecture. There will be various tools that are being developed for the protection of cultural heritage and, let's say, the tackling illicit trafficking of cultural goods. We're presenting 5 tools. One is the data modeling and digital twins for enhanced authentication preservation. The result of it will be the definition of a digital composite indicator for ontologies, typologies, for cultural goods.
I don't understand those words, so please, I think many of my listeners are not archaeologists. Can you explain those for me?
Okay, so let's say that it will be a digital copy of various cultural goods, let's say a digital identity, a replicate of an actual object through various technologies. Another tool will be, let's say, reconstruction of an incomplete project. Have in mind, like incomplete cultural goods you see at a museum, how you can use digital technologies to make them complete. Other tools for using artificial intelligence and machine learning to represent better possible connections of unknown cultural goods to known objects or other sites. A very fascinating tool that Eratosthenis actually is developing is the Earth Observation Toolkit that uses satellite imagery to, let's say, monitor endangered sites from illicit trafficking. So it gives indications to and alerts to national authorities for illegal activities. And then we have a couple of more tools like web crawler to collect data from, let's say, social media or other sources, inventories of various museums and authorities for lists of known goods. So all of them together are expected to help authorities like the Cyprus Police, Customs and Excise Department, border control. So we're trying to make their life easier and help on the decision-making process where they stop people for checking or any, let's say, vehicles that could carry some suspicious, let's say, objects.
Is this really aimed, I think, at archaeologists to be able to use these tools? You're going to introduce these tools at that seminar so that archaeologists elsewhere can perhaps make use of them?
Yeah. Actually, it's a hybrid event. So apart from the Cypriot archaeologists that will be present at the event, the participation can be done from anywhere in the world. So we are targeting all interested parties. So we have as end users, archaeologists, border control authorities, the Cyprus Police, and museums. I mean, everybody could use this tool. It will be a unified platform, offering these 5 tools that I mentioned earlier.
Lovely. Now then, very, very quickly, do tell us where people can find the details if they want to sign up to join you.
Yeah, you can find them on the social media of Enigma project. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and X, and also through Eratosthenis Center of Excellence social media.
Okay, so if people Google Enigma project, it's bound to come up in one of those platforms. Marios Tsouvaras, Research Coordinator at the Eratosthenis Center of Excellence here in Cyprus. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.